Hello, I'm Tiffany, creator of Red Petal Patterns, and today I want to talk about stitch holders and stitch markers and the differences in what you would use them for. I cannot possibly exaggerate the usefulness of stitch markers. It is one of the most important tools besides your needles and your yarn. I would never recommend to not buy stitch markers. You do not have to be fancy with them. Paper clips and safety pins and little short pieces of yarn that are looped around themselves make stitch markers just as well as store-bought ones. You do not need fancy metal with beads and magnetic and special shapes, and that's not necessary. If you have the money and you really want it and it makes you happy, go ahead, but you don't have to have it. You can buy a box like this full of hundreds of stitch markers for just a couple of dollars online. They are really not expensive, and there's no reason not to have them and to have as many as possible. I think the biggest bang for your buck is going to be locking stitch markers. There are three basic types of stitch marker. You're going to have ring markers, and they are just usually a plastic. They also make metal ring. And the reason you would have metal ones is they're usually magnetic, so that you can have a magnet strip that you can put them on and not lose them. I have cats. I'm going to lose stitch markers. Those will come in different sizes. Of course, you would use small ones on small knits with thin yarn and thin needles, and you would use larger ones with larger needles and larger yarn. And these will usually slide along your work every single time you finish a row. You would just slip this onto the next needle, or every time you finish a stitch and these have marked your place in that stitch, you would just slip it to the next needle. These do not need to be moved. They're not for any reason other than to mark a section, or you would mark off a section between two markers, or you would just have one marker and you're supposed to do something at that space every single time you come to it, and this helps remind you to do that. And it tells you where it is without you having to stop and look or count every time. Or you could have two markers and you're supposed to increase until there's this many stitches between the markers, or decrease until there's this many stitches between the markers. And you would always decrease or increase right there in that space. And it's just such a useful tool to keep you from having to write notes and count constantly for every row or every section. There are also split ring, and that is just what it sounds like. They're a ring that has a little split in it. And these can be added or taken away as needed. They can be used exactly the same way as the closed ring ones, but they have the ability to be added on to a stitch at any point in time and removed at any point in time. And then there are locking stitch markers, and they're called locking because you can lock them like a safety pin. They just close and they will stay in place. And these are the ones that I prefer to use most of the time because I have the most colors and I have the ability to take them out and move them around as needed. And these can be used on your needle the same way as the closed ones, or they can be added at any point in time to a stitch. And because they come in so many colors, you can color code. So if you're supposed to do one stitch between one type of stitch in this section and another type of stitch in this section, you can mark the beginning and the end in the same color. Or you can mark, a lot of people will use blue at the beginning. You want to mark the beginning of your round, so you use a blue stitch marker. And that helps you keep track of what you're doing. And you can have a beginning color and an end color if you were doing a really complicated pattern. You can also have stitch holders, and they work a lot like the locking markers do. They have a part that opens and closes, so you can slide your stitches on and off of them. There will be times that you will need to put a certain amount of stitches onto a holder and reserve them for later for any purpose, like to keep you from having to pick up a collar or something like that. And when you do this, these will just hang out separate. You can just as easily use a needle and a long piece of yarn, and it will be called waste yarn on a pattern. It'll say you need a stitch holder or waste yarn, and you can just feed that yarn through those stitches, tie it in a bow, and set those off to the side. I tend to use waste yarn more than a stitch holder, because this can get clunky and in my way, where a piece of yarn tied into a bow will just lay off to the side and be out of my way. But either one is proper. They have a new type of stitch holder that they call barber cords. And all it is a silicone tube or a rubber tube that's about the size of your needles. You can buy them. You don't have to buy a fancy kit that has them in it. You can literally buy them in a 20-yard roll for a couple of bucks on Amazon and cut it yourself. And the advantage of having the tube is that it's flexible, like the yarn would be, but it's stiff enough and has a hole in it that makes it easy to put your needle on. And that was the other thing I wanted to tell you. If you get this type of stitch holder, you want to make sure you get the ones. This one doesn't have one, but some of my others do. You want the kind that has a blunt point on it with a divot in the center. And that is so when you transfer your stitches back onto your needle, you can put your needle point in that divot and then slide them right over to the needle. And you can do that with those barber cords, or as I said, those are silicone or rubber cords that you can buy online, yards and yards and yards and yards of it, and I think they're really, really cheap. You're going to pay like 60 cents a yard for them if you buy them yourself online and cut them. Along with the little stoppers that you can put on them to keep the stitches from falling off. They are so insanely super cheap, and I would feel bad about myself if I didn't tell you that. Okay, on top of a way to hold live stitches, these are live stitches, they have not been bound off. On top of being able to hold live stitches and being able to mark your work, you also may want to have bobbins. And bobbins are, if you were doing color work, you would have a bunch of small little balls of yarn, and in order to keep them in small little balls, you would wrap them around a bobbin. Now, I have a couple of bobbins, but I don't generally use them. What I actually use are the little plastic ties that come from bread bags. And this is also handy after you have cast on and you have that little tail, or anytime you're doing color work in the back in tarsia and you have a little tail, you can wrap it in a bread tie and it will stay nice and neat and out of your way and not unravel. If you're really lucky, you will find larger ones. These usually come with onions and those bags of apples and oranges that you can buy, so produce. And if you're really lucky, you can get a giant one like this that came on a bag of potatoes, but I don't see these very often anymore, and I only have two. but they come in very handy. When you are storing circular needles, you can put these on the cord and write what size they are so that you can keep them organized. You can use these in conjunction with a stitch holder, a stitch marker. So if you were to put a stitch marker on here and then one of these tags on the stitch marker, and you can now mark front or back, or you can mark right sleeve, left sleeve. You can mark your left front, right front. When you finish a piece, you can mark it as to what it is so that you don't have to figure it out later. And if you use dry erase marker, that'll just come off. If you use a permanent marker or a sticker, that will come off with alcohol. Back to stitch markers. I have said I cannot overemphasize how important the stitch markers are. You can also use stitch markers as counters. And a counter would be, it would tell you if you, let's say you were supposed to decrease every 4 rows 20 times. Instead of sitting there and counting 1, 2, 3, 4, now I need to do an increase, 1, 2, 3, 4, now I need to do an increase, oh gosh, how many increases did I do? I'm going to count my stitches and see. Instead, you can use stitch markers, and you can do this a few different ways. You can mark on the edge every single time you've done that increase. You can mark every single time you have completed X amount of rows. You can mark, if you were doing buttonholes, you can mark those. I generally, when I'm doing a sweater, I will do the fronts and the back all in one piece. And when I do a buttonhole, I will take a marker and put it on the same row on the other side. Then when I get finished with my sweater, all of my buttonholes are marked. I don't have to measure them out or remark them to match where my buttons go are marked, because I marked every time I put a buttonhole on, and I don't have to do anything extra to figure that out. It's already marked. You can mark where you started your increases and decreases. If you're supposed to go another 5 inches after you finish this decrease, then you would mark that, and then you can you can measure from that marker instead of trying to look for the decrease and measure from there. You can also use it if you're supposed to have 15 decreases. If you were doing a sleeve and you needed 15 decreases, you can take 15 markers and put them in a chain, attach them to a corner somewhere, and every time you do a decrease, take one off. This way you know exactly how many more you have to do, and you know exactly how many you did, and you don't have to keep reaching for your stitch markers. They're already on your work. You don't have to carry this around with you and pull out new stitch markers. You can use them for multiple counts. If you had that you were supposed to increase on this side and decrease on this side, you can mark those. And you can use colors. Like I said, you can use blue for the beginning. You can use orange for decreases and pink for increases. You can figure out your own little color code for everything that you needed to do. If you were going to do 2 decreases every 4 rows, and then you were going to switch to 1 decrease every 6 rows, you can have your color change in there to indicate when you're going to start doing that other thing. And these are just little reminders so that you don't have to carry your pattern with you or any extra markers or counters. They do make counters that you can click, and it will click the numbers for you, or you can roll. It'll have a dial on it, so you can dial numbers, and those will help keep track of rows. They're called row counters. You sometimes have a lot of things going at once, and that can be tricky to keep up with all of those counters at the same time. I find that using stitch markers is just more intuitive than having extra mechanical things to keep up with. And that way you don't have to use a device or another gadget. They're just all right there in front of you that you can manipulate and carry with you without having to double check or count. And I believe that is the basics of what you need to know about stitch holders and stitch markers. I guess that's going to be all for today. I'll see you next time. Bye.